He walked out of that courthouse with a broken suitcase, a truck he wasn't sure he could keep, and 40 years of a life that had quietly come apart at the seams. No dramatic fight, no betrayal, just two people who had slowly stopped knowing each other, and a judge's signature to make it official. Caleb Mercer had given everything he had to everyone around him, and when it was over, he stood alone on that sidewalk watching his clothes scatter across the pavement like the last evidence of a man who had nothing left to show for it. If stories like this one hit different for you, the kind where real people fall apart and somehow find their way back, subscribe to this channel right now and follow Caleb's story all the way to the end. I promise you, where this goes will surprise you. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The divorce hearing lasted 43 minutes. Caleb had expected it to feel like something, a door slamming, a gut punch, the specific kind of silence that comes after a long argument finally burns itself out. Instead, it felt like a waiting room. Fluorescent lights, a water-stained ceiling tile he kept staring at. His attorney, a tired-looking man named Dennis, who smelled like old coffee and kept clicking his pen, leaned over twice to whisper things Caleb already knew. The settlement terms, the asset division, the formal language that turned a decade of his life into a checklist. Elena sat across from him at the long table. She wore a gray blazer he didn't recognize. Her hair was pulled back the way she used to wear it when she had something important to do. She didn't look at him much, and when she did, it wasn't angry. It was something closer to tired, and he wasn't sure if that was better or worse than anger. When the judge asked if both parties understood the terms and agreed to proceed, Elena said yes first, clear and quiet. Caleb said it a half-second later, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, like it had been sitting unused for too long. They signed. The judge said a few words that Caleb didn't fully absorb. And then it was done. He was 40 years old, he was divorced, and he had a court date stamped on a piece of paper to prove it. Outside, the October air hit him harder than he expected. Portland in the fall had a specific kind of cold, not brutal yet, but with enough bite to remind you winter was coming whether you were ready or not. He stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, his old brown suitcase at his feet, and just breathed. The suitcase had been his father's once. Heavy leather, brass latches that stuck if you didn't press both at exactly the right angle. He'd packed it 2 nights ago in the spare room of the apartment he'd been renting month to month since he and Elena agreed on a separation. He'd packed it because he wasn't sure where he was going after this, and having the suitcase with him felt like at least having something solid. He lifted it and started down the steps. He made it maybe 6 feet before the right latch gave out. The suitcase didn't just come open, it swung wide and hit the pavement, and half his stuff scattered across the bottom of the courthouse steps like some kind of announcement. A gray flannel shirt, a pair of work boots he'd meant to resole for 2 years, a folded paper bag with some documents inside, his phone charger, which skidded a solid 4 feet before stopping near the wheel of a parked bike. Caleb stood there for a second looking at it all. A woman walking past glanced down at his things and then up at him, and the expression on her face, not unkind, just briefly uncertain, was the one that finally made something twist in his chest. He crouched down and started gathering everything up, pressing the shirt and boots back inside, feeling the cold concrete through the knees of his slacks. "You need a hand?" He looked up. A younger guy, maybe mid-20s, had paused on the steps above him, suit and tie. Probably had business inside. "No," Caleb said. "I'm good, thanks." The guy nodded and kept going. Caleb got the suitcase closed again, pressing both latches down hard until they caught. He stood up and set it on its end and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked back at the courthouse doors. Elena would come out soon. He didn't want to be standing here when she did. He picked up the suitcase and walked to his truck. The truck was a 2009 Chevy, gray, dented above the rear left wheel well from a parking lot incident 2 winters ago that he'd never gotten around to fixing. There was a crack along the bottom of the driver's side mirror that he'd covered with a strip of electrical tape, and the heat sometimes took 10 minutes to come on properly. But it ran, and it was his, and right now it was also the only private space he had. He sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. His phone had 3 notifications. One from Dennis, confirming the paperwork would be filed by end of day. One from his building manager about a rent payment. One from his brother Marcus with a text that just said, "How'd it go?" with no punctuation. He set the phone face down on the passenger seat. Caleb had worked at Hargrove Rehabilitation Center for 11 years. He was the lead maintenance supervisor, which meant he was responsible for everything that could break in a 4-story medical facility. And in a building that size, that was a long list. Heating systems and hydraulic lift equipment, and outdated oxygen supply panels, and IV pump stations and elevator mechanicals, and the ancient freight elevator on the north side that nobody trusted but everyone still used because the main elevator was slow. He knew every system in that building the way you know a house you've lived in for years. The specific rattle of the south wing HVAC when the filter needed changing. The lag on the backup generator when it cycled. Which breaker in panel C would throw a false trip if the temperature dropped too fast. He was good at the work. He had always been good at the work. That had never been the question. The question, the one he and Elena had come back to again and again over 4 years of deteriorating conversations, was whether being good at work was enough to make a marriage function. The answer, apparently, was no. Yab. He'd met Elena Whitmore at a friend's birthday party 11 years ago, when he was 29 and she was 27, and neither of them had expected to meet anyone that night. She was finishing a graduate program in health administration. She was sharp, and a little intimidating, and laughed at things most people didn't find funny, which he'd liked immediately. He was working his way up at Hargrove, had just gotten his journeyman's certification, was still living with a roommate and eating sandwiches 4 nights a week because he was trying to save money. They dated for 2 years and got married in a small ceremony in her aunt's backyard. He remembered that day clearly. Not the ceremony itself so much as the hour before it, when he was standing in the aunt's kitchen in his rented suit eating crackers because he'd been too nervous to eat breakfast, and Elena had come in to find him. And she'd looked at him for a second and then started laughing, and he'd started laughing too, and that had been the moment he was most sure he'd made the right decision. For a few years it was good. Not perfect. They fought about money and about how he handled stress by going quiet instead of talking. And she handled stress by wanting to talk through everything immediately, which was its own particular form of incompatibility. But it was good. They had a life. Then his father's memory started slipping. It started small, the way these things always do. Hank Mercer was 68, still living alone in the house where Caleb had grown up in Vancouver, Washington, and for a while the signs were easy to explain away. He'd called Caleb by his older brother's name twice in 1 month. He'd forgotten an appointment. He'd left a burner on once and hadn't noticed until the smell reached the living room. By the time a neurologist at St. Vincent's used the word dementia in a sentence, Caleb had already been making the 3-hour round trip every weekend for 4 months. He didn't talk to Elena about how scared he was. He didn't know how to talk about it. The specific terror of watching a parent's mind come unmoored, the guilt of not being there more, the exhaustion of being someone's lifeline from a distance. He kept it inside and kept going to work and kept making the drives, and Elena kept asking what was wrong and he kept saying he was fine, and eventually she stopped asking, which was when things really started to come apart. The money was the other thing. His father's care wasn't covered well by insurance, and Caleb had started quietly pulling from their savings account without telling Elena because he couldn't figure out how to have the conversation about it. That was a mistake, and he knew it even as he was doing it. He told himself he'd replace it, that he'd figure out the numbers before she noticed, and then she noticed. That fight had lasted 2 days and left a scar that never fully healed. After that, it was a slow slide. Counseling for a few months, which helped some, and then didn't. Long stretches of polite distance. A vacation they took to the coast that should have been good and was instead mostly quiet. The specific sadness of 2 people who still cared about each other but couldn't figure out how to want the same things anymore. The papers had been filed 8 months ago. The separation had technically started 9 months before that. They had been falling apart for almost 2 years, and today it was just official. Caleb started the truck. He drove without a clear destination for a while, through the gray streets of downtown Portland, past the coffee shops and the construction, and the people walking with their heads down against the wind. Eventually, he pulled into a diner he'd been to a few times years ago, a narrow place on Burnside with vinyl booths and laminated menus, and a cook he could hear working in the back. He ordered coffee and eggs he didn't particularly want, and sat in the corner booth. The waitress was a heavy-set woman in her 50s with short red hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She refilled his coffee without being asked and didn't make conversation, and he was grateful for that. He thought about calling Marcus back. Marcus was 3 years older than him, lived in Boise, worked in insurance. They weren't close in the way some brothers were, but they showed up for each other when things got bad, which counted for something. He would call him tonight, probably. He thought about the apartment on Hemming Street that he needed to be out of by the end of the month, because the lease was in Elena's name, and they'd agreed she would take it. He'd been looking at rooms to rent. There was a place in Northeast he could probably afford if he was careful. He thought about his father. Hank was in a memory care facility now, a decent one in Camas called Riverbend. It had cost more than Caleb wanted to think about, and it had taken 2 months of paperwork and conversations with social workers and a particular phone call with the facility director that he'd had to step outside during his lunch break to make, because he couldn't do it from inside the building without his voice doing something embarrassing. His father had good days and bad days. Last Sunday he'd been sharp and funny, and they'd watched a football game together and talked about a road trip they'd taken when Caleb was 12, and it had felt almost normal. The Sunday before that, Hank hadn't known what year it was, and had thought Caleb was someone named Raymond, who, as far as Caleb could tell, didn't exist. That was the shape of it now. You held on to the good Sundays and got through the bad ones. He sat in that booth for a long time, longer than he'd meant to. The lunch crowd came and thinned out. The cook changed shifts, the waitress refilled his coffee a third time, and he finally ordered a piece of pie he didn't eat. He was thinking about the last conversation he'd had with Elena that hadn't been about logistics. It was 3 months ago, in the parking lot of the counselor's office after a session that had gone badly. She'd turned to him before getting in her car and said, "I don't think you ever really let me in, Caleb. I think you decided a long time ago that you were supposed to handle things yourself, and by the time I realized that wasn't going to change, too much time had passed." He hadn't said anything. He wasn't sure what he would have said. He still wasn't. He paid for the coffee and the eggs and the pie he hadn't touched, left a tip he probably shouldn't have, and walked back out into the cold. His suitcase was still in the bed of the truck, held in place by a bungee cord he'd looped through the handle. He stood looking at it for a second. 40 years old. A suitcase that couldn't stay closed. A truck with a cracked mirror and a heat problem. A storage unit with the rest of his things in it, including his tools and his father's old radio and a box of photographs he hadn't been able to look through yet. The sky was getting heavy in the west, the specific gray that came before rain in Portland, and the wind had picked up enough that he could feel it through his jacket. He didn't know exactly what came next. He knew he'd go to work tomorrow and the day after that, because the work was still there, and people were depending on him to show up, and showing up had always been the one thing he was sure of. He knew he'd drive to Camas on Sunday and sit with his father and see which version of him showed up that day. He knew he'd figure out the apartment and the finances and the 100 small logistics of rebuilding a daily life from scratch. What he didn't know was how to stop feeling like he'd spent 11 years giving everything he had and had somehow still come up short. That was the part he hadn't figured out yet. He got back in the truck, started the engine, and drove. He made it back to the apartment on Hemming Street a little before 4. It wasn't his apartment anymore, technically. Hadn't been for the past 8 months. Not really, though his name was still on the utilities through the end of October. Elena had moved back in after he'd taken the room on Morrison, a place he was renting from a retired school teacher named Gerald, who left passive-aggressive notes about thermostat settings and kept the hallway smelling like mothballs. The Hemming apartment was where they'd lived for 6 years, and Elena had wanted to keep it, and Caleb had agreed because it seemed like the right thing to do, which was how he made a lot of his decisions, quietly, without saying much about what it cost him. I wasn't there to go inside. He'd left a toolbox in the storage closet off the landing, one he'd been meaning to pick up for 3 weeks, and he needed it for work tomorrow. He'd texted Elena about it that morning. She'd said fine, she'd leave the key under the mat, she'd be at her sister's. The key was there. He got the toolbox. He was back on the stairs in 4 minutes. He almost made it out without incident. The door to the apartment across the hall opened as he was heading down, and Mrs. Farrow stepped out with a bag of recycling. She was 71, Hungarian-born, had lived in that apartment since before Caleb and Elena had moved in. She'd brought them soup once when Caleb had the flu, and she'd knocked on their door twice to complain about the volume of their arguments, which meant she'd heard things she was polite enough not to mention. She looked at Caleb, then at the toolbox, and her expression said she understood the situation completely. "You doing okay?" she asked. "Working on it," he said. She nodded slowly, the way older people sometimes do when they recognize something they've seen before. It gets easier, she said. Doesn't feel like it, but it does. He thanked her and kept going down the stairs. He wasn't sure he believed her, but he appreciated that she'd said it. Work. The next morning started at 6:15, which was the actual start time as opposed to the 7 o'clock official start time, because Caleb had found over 11 years that the 30 or 40 minutes before the rest of the maintenance crew arrived were the most useful part of the day. It was when he could walk the building without anyone flagging him down, when he could check things at his own pace and hear the building the way you had to hear it, not with paperwork in front of you, but just with your ears and your hands, and 11 years of accumulated understanding of how the place was supposed to sound when it was running right. Hargrove Rehabilitation Center occupied 4 floors of a building that had been expanded twice since its original construction in the late 80s, which meant the infrastructure was layered and inconsistent and full of legacy decisions that didn't always make sense until you traced them back to whoever had made them and why. The north wing had different electrical panels than the south wing. The third-floor HVAC had been retrofitted around a wall that shouldn't have been load-bearing but was. The freight elevator ran on a hydraulic system that was technically still within code, but that Caleb had been quietly documenting concerns about for the past 2 years, submitting maintenance reports that went to his supervisor, Walter Briggs, who passed them upstairs, where they apparently went to die. He started, as he always did, in the basement. The boiler room was where the building's mood lived, as far as Caleb was concerned. If something was wrong with the heating, you felt it in the basement first. If the water pressure was off, it showed up in the pipes along the east wall before it showed up anywhere a patient would notice. He moved through it with a flashlight even though the lights worked, because the flashlight let him look at specific things instead of just seeing the room. Everything looked the same as it had Friday. He noted that the condensate pump on the secondary boiler was showing a little more vibration than he liked, wrote it in his field notebook, and kept moving. By the time the rest of the crew arrived, 4 guys, one of whom was perpetually 15 minutes late and had been for 3 years, Caleb had a list and a plan for the day. Morning. That was Darnell, his best technician, a wiry 26-year-old from North Portland who'd come to Hargrove 2 years ago with an HVAC cert and a general distrust of authority that had softened slightly once he realized Caleb wasn't the type to micromanage. How was yesterday? Fine, Caleb said. Darnell looked at him for a second. He knew what yesterday had been. Caleb hadn't told him, but people knew things in a building where you worked closely together. Okay, Darnell said, and didn't push it. That was another thing Caleb appreciated about him. They split up the morning work. Darnell and a guy named Phil took the 3rd floor. 2 patient room call systems that had been flagging intermittently, plus a window seal on the east corridor that was leaking cold air and driving the nursing staff crazy. Caleb took the 2nd floor equipment room, where a portable suction unit had been making a noise that the nursing supervisor, a compact and perpetually direct woman named Rosa Medina, had described to him over the phone on Friday as like a cat in a washing machine. The suction unit was a piece of equipment used across the rehab floor for respiratory and wound care. It was older than it had any right to be, a Caraway Medical Model 7 that had been in service for at least 8 years. And the noise, when Caleb plugged it in and ran it, was exactly what Rosa had described. A cycling, uneven vibration that climbed in pitch under load and then caught and smoothed out before climbing again. He opened the casing. The issue turned out to be a worn impeller housing that had developed just enough play to let the impeller shaft wobble at certain RPMs. It wasn't catastrophic, not yet, but left alone another month it would be, and at that point the unit would fail mid-use, which in a clinical setting was a serious problem. He had the parts to fix the immediate issue. What he didn't have was a parts order approved for the secondary wear components. He could already see would need replacing within 60 days. He'd submitted that request 6 weeks ago. It was still pending. He sat back on his heels and looked at the unit and thought about the report he'd submitted, the one that had gone nowhere, the one about the freight elevator, and the one before that about the backup generator's fuel line integrity, and the pattern that emerged when you laid them side by side. He wasn't angry about it, exactly. It was more like a tiredness he couldn't fully put down. He fixed what he could fix, documented what he'd found and what remained outstanding, and moved on. Rosa Medina found him around 10:30, which was typical. She ran the 2nd and 3rd floor nursing operations with a precision that Caleb respected, and that occasionally made the staff nervous in the way that competence sometimes does. "The suction unit," she said, appearing in the doorway of the equipment room. "Fix the primary issue. There are secondary components that need to be replaced within the next 6 to 8 weeks, and I've got a pending parts request for most of them. I'll flag it as urgent." "I flagged it as urgent 6 weeks ago." "I know. I'm flagging it again." She looked at him with an expression he'd learned to read over years of these interactions. Not frustration at him, but at the system behind him, and a kind of resigned acknowledgement that he was doing what he could within it. "How are you doing?" she said, changing register so cleanly that it took him a second to catch up. "I'm fine, Rosa." "It was yesterday?" "It was yesterday." She nodded. She'd been divorced herself, she'd mentioned once, years ago, in the way people mention things like that. Briefly, without drama, as a piece of information rather than an invitation to go deeper. She had 2 teenagers and worked 50-hour weeks and didn't complain about either. "The freight elevator," she said. "I had a patient transport issue again on Friday. It stalled for 6 minutes between 2 and 3. "I know, I got the incident report. It's in my documentation." "Caleb." She said his name the way people say a name when they want you to hear something more than the words that follow it. "That elevator carries patients. Some of them can't take the stairs. If it fails with someone on it—" "I know," he said. "Believe me, I know." "Then what's the holdup?" He exhaled slowly. "The holdup is above my head. I've submitted 3 maintenance reports in the past 22 months. Briggs has seen all of them. Whatever happens after that isn't something I can control." She was quiet for a moment. "That's not good enough." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She left without saying anything else, which was its own kind of answer. He called Marcus that evening from the parking lot of a grocery store he'd stopped at on the way back to his rented room. He sat in the truck with a bag of food he'd throw together into something that passed for dinner, and Marcus picked up on the 3rd ring. "Hey!" Marcus's voice had that particular tone it got when he was managing his reaction to something, careful and even. "How are you doing?" "I'm okay." "That's not what I asked." Caleb looked out the windshield at the parking lot. A woman was loading groceries into the back of a minivan. A kid was sitting in the cart, kicking his legs. "I don't know how I'm doing," he said. "Better than I thought I would. Worse than I'm letting on, somewhere in there." "That sounds about right." A pause. "You staying somewhere decent?" "It's fine. The landlord leaves notes about the heat." "What kind of notes?" "The passive-aggressive kind." Marcus made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You need money?" "No?" "Caleb." "I don't, Marcus. I'm okay there." He wasn't entirely okay there, but he wasn't ready to have that conversation yet. The storage unit cost money. The new room cost money. His father's facility cost money. He was technically still current on all of it, but the margins were tighter than they'd been in years, and the weight of that was something he felt in his chest at odd moments when he wasn't focused on something else. "You eating?" Marcus asked. "I'm in a grocery store parking lot right now." "That's not what I asked either." "I'm eating, Marcus." Another pause. Caleb could hear a TV in the background, so something with crowd noise, maybe a game. Marcus had a wife named Donna and 2 kids under 10 and a house with a yard in Boise. It was a different life from Caleb's in every way except their last name. "I know you and Elena." "I know it wasn't sudden," Marcus said carefully. "But still, it's still a thing." "Yeah." "She okay?" "I think so. I don't really know." "You talked to her?" "At the end. A little." He paused. "She said some things that were probably true. I said basically nothing. That's kind of been our dynamic for a while." "Caleb?" Marcus's voice had shifted slightly. The careful tone dropped a little. "You know you do that, right? You go quiet, and then you're surprised when people feel shut out." "I know. Dad used to do the same thing." That landed somewhere specific, and Caleb didn't respond to it right away. "I know," he said again, quieter this time. "How is he?" "Good last Sunday. I'll see him this weekend." They talked for another 20 minutes about nothing in particular. Marcus's kids, a car issue Marcus was dealing with, whether their cousin had actually moved to Phoenix or just said he was going to. Normal conversation, the kind that didn't ask anything too difficult, and Caleb was grateful for it even as he recognized that it was both of them doing the thing they'd been doing their whole lives, orbiting the things that were hard rather than going directly at them. When he finally hung up, the The parking lot had thinned out. The woman with the minivan was gone. He picked up his grocery bag and went inside to find something to make for dinner. The storm hit midweek. It came out of the coast the way Pacific storms did, fast and wet and indifferent. And by Thursday afternoon, the streets were flooding in the low spots and there were tree branches down across half the city. Hargrove Rehabilitation Center had a backup generator system for exactly this kind of situation, and it kicked in properly when the power went out at 2:40 in the afternoon. Caleb was already in the building when it happened, had been watching the weather reports all morning, and had made sure his crew was prepared. The transition to backup power went smoothly, and for about 20 minutes it seemed like they were going to get through the outage without serious incident. Then the call came from the third floor. One of the portable infusion pump stations, a rolling unit that supplied IV medication delivery to patients in the overflow ward, had lost power completely and wasn't responding to the backup system. The nurse who called it in, a young man named Terrence, who sounded like he was working hard not to sound panicked, said there were 2 patients on active infusion and the pumps had gone dark. Caleb was there in 4 minutes. The unit was a Medavant Series 4 pump station, one of 3 that the facility used for overflow capacity. The issue was immediately clear when he pulled the power panel. The connection between the unit and the facility's backup circuit was running through a distribution hub that had developed an intermittent ground fault, and the fault had tripped the unit's internal protection relay. The fix took 11 minutes. He had to bypass the faulty hub using a direct connection he rigged from a secondary circuit, which wasn't elegant and wasn't something he'd recommend as a permanent solution, but it got the pumps back online. Terrence and the other nurse on duty confirmed both patients were stable. When it was done, Caleb stood in the hallway for a moment and wrote everything down in his field notebook. The faulty hub, the specific fault behavior, the bypass solution and why it was temporary. He wrote it all down because that was what he did. Not because he expected anyone above Walter Briggs to read it, but because the documentation was the record, and the record mattered even if nobody looked at it until something went wrong. He was still writing when a voice from the far end of the hallway said, "Excuse me." He looked up. The woman walking toward him didn't look like she belonged on the 3rd floor of a rehab facility. She was in her early 60s, he'd have guessed, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of posture that people either were born with or spent a lot of money acquiring. She wore a dark wool coat, quality fabric, understated. She was moving through the hallway with the calm of someone who was used to walking into rooms and having people adjust to her presence. Behind her, half a step back and clearly uncertain whether to keep up, was a younger woman in a blazer who appeared to be trying to manage both a tablet and a phone simultaneously. "I heard there was a power situation," the silver-haired woman said, stopping a few feet from Caleb. "It's resolved," he said. 2 patients on infusion pumps lost power when the backup circuit experienced a ground fault. We've got them back online with a temporary fix." She looked at him with sharp, clear eyes that were doing something he recognized, the kind of look that was actually paying attention rather than just appearing to. "How temporary?" "Permanent fix requires replacing the distribution hub. I'd estimate a 3 to 4 hour job with the right parts, which I can have here by tomorrow morning. Until then, the bypass is stable, but I'll want someone checking it every 40 minutes. "And you've documented this?" He held up the notebook. "Everything since I walked in the door." She was quiet for a moment. "Were the patients at risk?" "For the 11 minutes the pumps were down, yes. There was risk. We got to it fast." She nodded, and something in her expression was working through the information in a way that was more focused than curious. "How long has the hub been faulty?" she said. He paused. "I flagged a concern about the distribution system on this floor in a maintenance report 7 weeks ago. The hub wasn't identified as a specific failure point at that time, but the report noted the system needed inspection." "Was it inspected?" He looked at her steadily. "No." The younger woman behind her had stopped pretending to look at her tablet and was listening openly now. "What's your name?" the silver-haired woman said. "Caleb Mercer, maintenance supervisor." She extended her hand with a directness that wasn't unfriendly, but also didn't have anything performative about it. "Vivian Cross." The name didn't register immediately. He shook her hand the way he always did, firmly, and then his brain caught up to where he'd heard that name. Cross Medical Technologies. He'd seen it on equipment, not at Hargrove, which couldn't afford Crosstech, but he'd seen it on the newer units at a county facility where he'd done some contract work 2 years ago. The logo was a stylized cross shape in silver and blue. High-end medical equipment, the kind of company whose product catalogs got left in conference rooms as aspirational reading material. "You're inspecting the facility?" he asked, because he genuinely wasn't sure what else to ask. "My nephew is a patient here," she said. "Has been for 3 weeks. Hip replacement recovery." She said it matter-of-factly, without the softening people sometimes put around medical disclosures. "When the power went out, I was in his room. I came to see what was happening." "Your nephew's okay," Caleb said. "If he's in the main ward, the circuit that failed is isolated to the overflow section." Something in her face shifted slightly, and he thought it might have been relief, though it was gone before he could be sure. "Good," she said. He almost left it there. He would have, except for what she said next. "You documented a concern 7 weeks ago that wasn't acted on." "That's right." "Is that typical?" He looked at her for a moment, considered the question and what the honest answer was and what the smart career answer was, and then said the honest one because it was who he was. "It's become typical, yeah. I've got 22 months of maintenance reports in a folder in my office. A lot of them are still pending. The elevator on the north side is the one that worries me most." She looked at him with those sharp eyes. "Why?" "Because it carries patients, and because I've flagged it 3 times, and the status on the repair request still says under review." The younger woman had definitely stopped looking at her tablet now. "I'd like to see those reports," Vivian said. "Not today. I need to get back to my nephew. But if you're willing to share them, I'd like to see them." Caleb studied her face for a second. It wasn't a power move. It wasn't the look of someone setting something up. It was the look of someone who had just gotten information they took seriously and were figuring out what to do with it. "I can get you copies," he said. She took a card from the pocket of her wool coat and handed it to him. It was a simple card, cream-colored with dark lettering. Her name, her direct email, a phone number. No title on the card, which he found interesting. The people who didn't need to put their title on a card were the ones whose title spoke for itself. "Thank you for getting those pumps back on," she said. 11 minutes is fast. Faster would have been fixing the hub 7 weeks ago. She held his gaze for a beat longer than expected, and then she nodded once, turned, and walked back down the hall with the younger woman trailing behind her. Caleb stood there for a moment with the card in his hand. He wasn't sure what to make of the conversation. In his experience, when people in expensive coats asked to see your maintenance reports, it didn't usually lead anywhere particularly good. But something about the way she'd listened, the quality of the attention she'd paid to what he said, the way she'd asked follow-up questions instead of nodding politely and moving on, had felt different enough that he didn't throw the card away. He put it in the front pocket of his work shirt and went back to checking the bypass connection. That Sunday, he drove to Camas. Riverbend Memory Care was a single-story facility about 8 miles from the house where Caleb had grown up. It was well-maintained in the way that places funded partly by state assistance tried to be, clean, functional, with cheerful colors in the common areas that were clearly chosen by someone who'd read a study about calming environments. The staff were decent. That was the main thing. The staff were decent. His father was having a bad morning. Caleb knew it when he walked in, and the aide at the front desk, a young woman named Kezia, who worked Sundays, gave him the particular look that the staff gave when they wanted to prepare you for something without alarming you. "He was a little confused earlier," she said. "He settled down, but he might not be having his best day." Hank Mercer was sitting in the chair by the window in his room when Caleb came in. He was 70 years old and looked, on bad days, closer to 80. He'd been a big man once, broad through the shoulders, the kind of hands that you noticed when he shook yours. He still had the hands, though they sat in his lap differently now, like they'd forgotten what they were for. He looked up when Caleb came in. "Hey, Pop," Caleb said. His father looked at him for a moment with the expression that Caleb had learned to interpret over the past 2 years. A search behind the eyes, something working to connect. "Hey," his father said, and the word didn't have a name attached to it. Caleb pulled a chair over and sat down without making an issue of it. He'd learned not to push. He'd learned that the best thing he could do on the bad days was just be there, talking about normal things, letting the familiar texture of his voice do whatever work it could do. "It's cold out," he said, "coming in from the coast. There was a bad storm Thursday." His father looked at the window. Thursday, he repeated, as if locating the word. Yeah, power went out at work for a while. We had a situation, but we handled it. Work. His father's hands moved slightly in his lap. You're at the building. Hargrove. Yeah. 11 years. 11 years. Something in his father's eyes shifted, not full recognition exactly, but something adjacent to it, a warmth that wasn't there before. You were always good with your hands, like your grandfather. You used to say that. Still true. His father looked at him. You look tired. I'm okay, Pop. Something happened. Caleb looked at his father's face. On a bad day, the specifics were gone. Names, dates, context. But the emotional antennae stayed intact longer than you'd think, which was one of the things about the disease that broke Caleb open a little every time he was reminded of it. Elena and I finalized the divorce on Monday, he said. His father was quiet for a moment. He might not have known who Elena was right now. He might have. It was impossible to tell. You okay? His father said. Working on it. His father nodded slowly. Then he said, with the specific certainty of someone reporting a fact, You always carry too much by yourself. Caleb sat with that for a second. Yeah, he said finally. I know. They stayed like that for a while, the two of them, in the quiet room with the window that looked out at a strip of bare trees and a gray November sky. And Caleb thought about maintenance reports that nobody read, and a card in his shirt pocket, and a suitcase that wouldn't stay closed, and his father's hands resting in his lap, still shaped like the hands of a man who knew how to build things. He didn't know where any of it was going. He just sat there, and that was enough for now. He emailed the reports on Monday morning. It took him 40 minutes to compile them, not because they were hard to find, but because he wanted to make sure what he sent was organized in a way that was clear without being defensive. 22 months of maintenance documentation, sorted chronologically, with a brief summary at the top that laid out the three major outstanding issues: the freight elevator on the north side, the distribution hub failure on the third-floor overflow circuit, and the backup generator fuel line integrity concern he'd flagged in February. He attached the original reports, the follow-up submissions, and the incident log from Thursday's pump station failure. He read it through twice before sending it. Then he sat looking at Vivian Cross's card for a moment, typed her email address into the to field, and hit send before he could think about it too long. He wasn't sure what he expected. Probably nothing. People asked for things and then got busy and forgot, and that was especially true of people who ran companies and had assistants managing their inboxes, and whose time was accounted for in ways that didn't leave a lot of room for following up on conversations with maintenance supervisors in hospital hallways. He'd sent the reports because she'd asked, and because the information was accurate and documented and real, and because some part of him that he couldn't fully explain felt like the documentation deserved to exist somewhere outside the folder in his office where it had been quietly accumulating for almost 2 years. By noon, he'd mostly forgotten about it and was dealing with a water pressure issue on the 4th floor that turned out to be a partially closed isolation valve somebody had bumped without realizing it. Her reply came at 4:17 in the afternoon. It was 4 sentences long. She thanked him for the reports. She said she'd had someone on her team review them. She said she'd like to meet with him in person and asked if he was available Wednesday afternoon. She gave a downtown address. He read it 3 times. Then he read it a 4th time because he was trying to determine what the meeting was about, and 4 sentences didn't give him much to work with. She hadn't said what the meeting was for. She hadn't offered any indication of what her team had concluded about the reports. She'd simply asked if he was available, which was the kind of directness he'd noticed in the hallway on Thursday, and which he was finding, on reflection, either refreshing or unsettling depending on what minute of the day it was. He replied that he was available and asked if 2 o'clock worked. She said yes. He didn't tell anyone about the meeting, not Darnell, not Rosa, not Marcus. He went about the rest of Monday and all of Tuesday doing his job, dealing with a thermostat calibration issue on the 2nd floor and a section of ceiling tile in the east corridor that had been compromised by a slow leak from the bathroom above it, and a parts delivery that arrived incomplete for the 3rd consecutive month, which required a phone call to the vendor that Caleb kept professionally calm through by the specific mental effort of someone counting seconds between responses. Tuesday night, he sat in his room on Morrison Street and ate leftover pasta he'd made on Sunday, and watched a college football game he didn't care about and thought about what Vivian Cross could possibly want with him. The scenarios he came up with ranged from genuinely useful, maybe she was on a hospital board somewhere and wanted to bring the Hargrove maintenance failures to someone's attention, to less useful, the kind where a rich person asks a lot of questions, feels she's done something, and then nothing changes. He'd seen the second scenario more times than the first. He turned the game off at 9:30 and went to sleep. The address she'd given him was a building in the Pearl District, the kind of neighborhood that had been warehouses 30 years ago and was now the kind of place where architecture firms and technology companies paid for the light and the exposed brick and the specific energy of a space that said we have resources and taste. The building directory in the lobby listed Cross Medical Technologies on the 14th and 15th floors. The elevator opened onto a reception area that was more understated than he'd expected. Clean lines, dark wood, a few pieces of medical equipment displayed in a way that was more gallery than showroom. The receptionist directed him to a conference room with a long table and a view of the West Hills that would have been better if it hadn't been raining again. Vivian was already in the room when he got there. So was the younger woman from the hospital, the one with the tablet, whose name turned out to be Nina, and who was apparently Vivian's director of operations. There was also a man Caleb didn't recognize, maybe 40, in a flannel shirt under a sport coat, who was introduced as Derek Sato, the company's head of field engineering. "Thanks for coming in," Vivian said, and gestured to the chair across from her. Caleb sat down. He'd worn a clean shirt and his better jacket, which was a thing he'd thought about more than he wanted to admit. "We went through the reports," Vivian said. She wasn't preambling. He was starting to understand that preamble wasn't something she did. Derek had some questions. Derek Sato leaned forward slightly. He had the kind of eyes that were quietly measuring things, which Caleb recognized because he had the same eyes. "The pump station bypass you rigged on Thursday," he said. "You used a direct secondary circuit connection to get around the faulty hub." "That's right. What gauge wire did you use for the bridging connection?" 12 gauge, rated for the load. I checked the amperage draw on both pumps before I committed to the connection." Derek nodded, writing something. "The hub failure. You said it was a ground fault. Did you identify where the fault originated?" "Insulation breakdown on the ground lid, likely from thermal cycling. The hub's in a section of the utility chase that runs close to the HVAC return duct. Temperature differential over time. I couldn't do a full inspection Thursday because I needed to get the pumps back up, but I noted it in the report, and it's on my list for this week." Derek looked at Vivian briefly, then back at Caleb. "The freight elevator report from February. You mentioned the hydraulic fluid pressure was showing cyclical drops under load." "Yeah, not dramatic. We're talking about a drop that's within the acceptable variance on paper. But the pattern of the drop was wrong. It wasn't gradual. It was showing a specific dip at the same point in the cycle every time, which suggests a mechanical cause, not just age. Most likely the main pressure relief valve is partially sticking." "Did you disassemble the valve to confirm?" "No, I don't have authorization to take the elevator out of service long enough to do that. I documented the pattern and submitted the report recommending the inspection." "But you're confident in the diagnosis?" Caleb looked at him. "I've been maintaining that building for 11 years. I'm confident enough that I've submitted the report 3 times. Derek sat back in his chair. Vivian had been watching the exchange without interrupting. Now she set her hands flat on the table in the way she had, like someone anchoring themselves to the surface before saying something direct. "I want to explain why I asked you here," she said. "And I want to be straightforward with you because I think you're someone who responds better to that than to setup." "Generally, yeah." Cross Medical makes equipment. High-end medical devices, pumps, monitors, diagnostic systems. We design them to be the best performing equipment in the field when they're installed correctly and maintained properly. She paused. "The problem we keep running into is that the gap between how the equipment is designed to function and how it actually functions in real clinical environments is bigger than it should be. Our engineers design to spec and run tests in controlled settings, and then the equipment goes into a facility and the real world is not a controlled setting." "No," Caleb said, "it's not. We need people who understand both sides of that gap. People who've spent years in the field maintaining equipment and who actually understand what happens when a machine meets real-world conditions. The temperature cycling, the voltage irregularities, the deferred maintenance, the workarounds." She looked at him steadily. From your reports and from the conversation on Thursday, you're someone who thinks that way. Caleb looked at the table for a moment. He wasn't sure what to say, so he said what was true. I'm a maintenance supervisor at a rehab facility. I'm not an engineer. I know what you are, she said. I'm not asking you to be an engineer. I'm asking you to be something we don't actually have on staff, which is a person who can sit in a room with our design team and tell them what it's actually like to keep this equipment running in a real hospital. Someone who can look at a new device spec and tell us where it's going to fail in the field before we put it in production. Someone who can go into facilities and evaluate installation and maintenance protocols against the reality of how these places actually operate. The room was quiet for a moment. You're talking about a job, Caleb said. I'm talking about creating a position for you, yes. He sat with that for a second. Outside the window, the rain was coming in sideways now, running in sheets down the glass. I have a job, he said. I know. And I don't have a degree. I've got my journeyman certification and my supervisor's cert and 11 years of experience. I'm aware. He looked at her. Why me specifically? You talked to me for 10 minutes in a hospital hallway. She was quiet for a beat, and he had the impression she was deciding something about how much to say. I've been aware of Hargrove's maintenance situation for longer than last Thursday, she said. I have a nephew there. I've seen the facility. 3 weeks of visiting will tell you a lot about how a building is actually being run. She looked at him directly. I'd heard from the nursing staff, Rosa Medina specifically, that the maintenance issues weren't being addressed and that the supervisor was the one person documenting them correctly. I already knew your name before I walked into that hallway. Caleb absorbed that slowly. Rosa, he said. She wasn't complaining about you. She was defending you. There's a difference. He thought about Rosa standing in the doorway of the equipment room, saying, that's not good enough, with the flatness of someone who'd said it before and expected to have to say it again. The position, he said carefully. What does it look like? Nina, who had been quiet until now, slid a folder across the table. We put together an outline. Title would be Field Technology Consultant. It's a new role. We're building the description around what we need, rather than fitting you into something existing. She opened the folder and walked him through it. The responsibilities, the travel component, the compensation, the structure of how he'd interface with the engineering team. He listened carefully. He asked 3 questions, all of them practical, about the travel schedule, about the reporting structure, about whether the role would require him to relocate. No relocation requirement, Vivian said. Portland's actually a good base for us. We have facilities up and down the coast. He looked at the numbers on the page. They were considerably higher than what Hargrove paid him, which wasn't difficult given that Hargrove's pay scale hadn't adjusted meaningfully in 4 years. But it was still a number that sat in front of him like a question he wasn't sure he knew how to answer. I need to think about it, he said. Of course, Vivian said. Take the folder. Take whatever time you need. She paused. But I'd ask that you think seriously about it. Not because we're doing you a favor. I want to be clear that this is a business decision, and we're approaching it that way. We need what you can offer. But I've seen enough facilities operating the way Hargrove operates to know that you're in a situation where the work you're doing isn't being properly recognized or supported, and that's a waste of something that has genuine value. He looked at her for a moment. You sound like you've thought about this a lot, he said. I've spent 40 years in medical technology. I've seen a lot of broken systems and a lot of people trying to do good work inside them. She said it simply, without drama. I recognize it when I see it. He drove back to Morrison Street with the folder on the passenger seat and his thoughts doing something he couldn't quite organize. He sat in the truck outside his building for 10 minutes before going in. He didn't make a decision that night. He made pasta again, which was becoming a pattern, and sat at the small kitchen table in his rented room reading through the folder 3 times. And then he put the folder down and sat in the specific quiet of a room where nobody was expecting anything from him and tried to figure out what he actually thought. Part of what he thought was that it was too convenient. Things didn't work this way. You didn't walk out of your divorce and have a woman in a wool coat hand you a new life within a week. That was the kind of thing that happened in the version of the world that existed in movies, not in the version where your suitcase fell open on courthouse steps and your landlord left notes about the thermostat. But another part of him was paying attention to what Vivian had actually said, which was that she'd known about the situation at Hargrove, had talked to Rosa, had made a deliberate decision to find out more about the person behind the maintenance reports. That wasn't magic. That was a person paying attention and following it to a logical conclusion. He understood that. He spent his entire working life doing exactly that. He thought about the maintenance reports. 22 months of documentation going nowhere. The freight elevator that still hadn't been fixed. The parts requests that aged out without being approved. The specific exhaustion of doing the right thing inside a system that rewarded something other than doing the right thing. He thought about what his father had said. You always carry too much by yourself. He called Marcus. It's late, Marcus said. It's 9:40. I have kids, Caleb. 9:40 is late. Sorry, I need to talk to you about something. There was a shuffling sound, and Caleb could hear Marcus moving to another room. Okay, Marcus said. What is it? Caleb told him about Vivian, about the meeting, about the folder on the table in front of him. He told it straight, without editorializing, the way he told things when he wanted someone else's unfiltered reaction rather than their validation. Marcus was quiet for a moment when he finished. Then, and you're hesitating because? Because it doesn't make sense. What doesn't make sense? A company like this doesn't hire a maintenance supervisor off a hospital hallway conversation. She said she already knew about you before the hallway. She said that, yeah. And you don't believe her? Caleb thought about Vivian's eyes across that conference table, the quality of attention she'd paid to Derek's questions and to his answers. I believe her, he said. That's not really the issue. What is? He looked at the folder. It's a big change. Yeah, it is. I'd be leaving the only job I've had for 11 years. A job where your work isn't being acted on. I know the building, Marcus. I know the systems. I know what needs fixing. You also just said that knowing what needs fixing hasn't actually gotten anything fixed. Caleb was quiet. Caleb? Marcus's voice had shifted into the register it went to sometimes when he was saying something he'd thought about more than he was showing. You spent 11 years being good at a job that kept making itself smaller around you. And I love you. But the reason you stayed is the same reason you didn't tell Elena about the money, and the same reason you don't call me when things are bad until they've been bad for a while. You've got this thing where you decide that the responsible choice is to stay put and hold everything together, and you do it even when the holding together is costing you more than it's worth. The kitchen in his rented room was so quiet he could hear the refrigerator cycling. That's a lot of words, Caleb said. I've been saving them up. When did you get philosophical? Around the third time Donna told me I needed to actually say the things I was thinking instead of just thinking them. Caleb almost smiled. She's smarter than both of us. By a significant margin, yeah. A pause. Take the meeting, take the job. You don't have to know exactly what you're walking into to know that what you're walking away from isn't working. Well, I went to see Walter Briggs the next morning. Walter's office was on the administrative floor, a room that smelled like old carpet and had a whiteboard on one wall that listed quarterly compliance benchmarks. Walter was 55, a former operations manager who'd moved into facility administration, and he was a decent enough man in the way that people who'd learned to operate inside systems tend to be decent. He followed protocols, he processed paperwork, he never raised his voice. He also hadn't pushed a single one of Caleb's maintenance reports further than his own desk, and after 11 years, Caleb had stopped being surprised by this and started simply documenting around it. I need to give you notice, Caleb said, from the chair across from Walter's desk. Walter looked at him over his reading glasses. Notice? 2 weeks. I've been offered another position. Walter took his glasses off. He looked at Caleb with something that wasn't quite surprise, more like the expression of someone who had understood something was coming without knowing exactly what form it would take. Where? Cross Medical Technologies. Walter blinked. The equipment company. Yeah. How did that come about? One of their people saw my maintenance documentation, Caleb said, which was true enough. They're creating a field consultant role. Walter was quiet for a moment. He looked at his desk, then back at Caleb. You've been here 11 years. I know. There are people here who depend on you. Caleb looked at him steadily. There are patients in this building who depend on equipment that hasn't been properly maintained because the reports I submitted for 22 months didn't translate into approved work orders. I've done everything I can do from where I sit, Walter, but I can't do more than document it and submit it and wait. Walter's jaw worked slightly. I forwarded every report you've given me. I know you have. I'm not saying you didn't. He paused. But something somewhere stopped them. And it wasn't me, and it wasn't you, and I'm not angry about that. I'm just telling you I need 2 weeks. Walter put his glasses back on. He looked like a man doing a calculation that wasn't coming out any way he liked. Fine, he said. 2 weeks. He stood up and extended his hand, and Caleb shook it, and that was the end of 11 years. He called Vivian's number on the way back down the stairs. Nina answered, which he'd half expected. He's accepting, Nina said into what was presumably Vivian's earpiece or speaker. And Caleb heard faintly Vivian say good in the background with the tone of someone closing a mental bracket she'd opened. 2 weeks' notice, Caleb told Nina. I can start the first Monday after that. We'll have the paperwork ready by Friday. Vivian would like to schedule an onboarding meeting for your first week. She'll want to walk you through the first site visit herself. Okay. And Mr. Mercer, she wanted me to tell you that you should bring that field notebook. He looked down at his work shirt, where the notebook was in the breast pocket the way it always was. Tell her I don't go anywhere without it. He told Darnell on Friday afternoon before the weekend. He'd waited until then partly because he wanted to do it in person, and partly because he'd needed the week to feel certain enough about the decision to say it out loud without it feeling like something that might dissolve if he named it. They were in the basement, running a routine pressure check on the secondary boiler, and Caleb waited until they'd finished the reading and Darnell had logged it in the system before he said it. I'm leaving Hargrove, he said. I gave Walter notice Wednesday. Darnell turned and looked at him. He was quiet for a moment in the specific way that Darnell processed things. Not reactive, but moving through it. Where are you going? He said. Cross Medical Technologies. Field consultant role. Cross Medical. Darnell repeated it the way Derek Sato had said 12 gauge, confirming a specific fact. That's a serious company. Yeah. Darnell looked at the boiler and then back at Caleb. That thing with the pump station Thursday, he said. That's what this is about. Partly. The elevator report. Partly that too. Darnell nodded slowly. He didn't say anything for a moment, and when he did it was quiet and specific. You should have moved on 2 years ago, the way they handled those reports. He paused. I'm not saying that against you. I'm saying you stayed longer than most would have. Caleb looked at the boiler casing, at the wear marks around the access panel from years of maintenance. His hands had made some of those marks. You're going to be the best person on this crew, he said. I'll tell Walter that. I already am the best person on this crew, Darnell said, without a trace of either arrogance or humor. Just a fact. Yeah, Caleb said. You are.
Yeah.
His last Sunday at Riverbend before he started the new job, his father was having a good day. It happened the way good days happened, unexpectedly, without announcement, as if the fog had simply moved off without explanation. Hank Mercer was sitting up in his chair when Caleb arrived, and he looked at Caleb when he walked in the door and said clearly, "Hey, there he is," like Caleb was walking into the kitchen at the old house in Vancouver after school. They watched football for an hour. His father remembered the names of 3 players and told Caleb a story about a game he'd watched with Caleb's grandfather that Caleb had heard before but listened to again because on the good days, the stories had all the details still in them. At some point, his father looked over at him during a commercial and said, "You doing better?" "Yeah," Caleb said. "Actually, yeah." Something changed. Something changed, Caleb agreed. His father turned back to the game. "Good," he said simply. "About time." Caleb looked at the side of his father's face, the familiar lines of it, the white stubble he hadn't gotten around to shaving, the way his hands rested on the armrests like they were at ease. He thought about everything that had brought him to this particular chair in this particular room on this particular afternoon. The divorce, and the courthouse steps, suitcase, and the storm, and the pump station, and the card in the wool coat pocket, and the folder on the kitchen table, and 2 weeks of notice, and 11 years of documentation that had finally, somehow, found someone who understood what it was worth. He wasn't sure what came next. He was sure that was okay. The game came back on, and his father leaned forward slightly, and outside the window the November sky had gone clear and pale blue, the kind of sky that appears sometimes after a long stretch of rain, clean and cold and wide open, not promising anything, just there. His first day at Cross Medical started in an elevator that worked. It was a small thing, and he knew it was a small thing, but he noticed it anyway. The smooth hydraulic lift, the solid thunk of the doors closing, the absence of that particular hesitation between floors that he'd spent 2 years documenting in a notebook. Nobody read. He rode up to the 14th floor with his field notebook in his jacket pocket and a cup of coffee he'd bought from a cart on the street below. And when the doors opened onto the reception area with its clean lines and its displayed equipment and its view of the West Hills still catching the last of the morning frost, he stood there for a second and let himself feel the strangeness of it. He'd packed his tools out of Hargrove on his last day in a gray plastic bin that Darnell had helped him carry to the truck without being asked. The crew had signed a card. Rosa had come down from the second floor to shake his hand, which was not something she did casually, and she'd said only, "Don't forget what you know," which he'd thought about more than once since then. Walter had processed his exit paperwork with the careful efficiency of a man who was not going to let anything show on his face, and at the end of it had said, in a voice that was doing more work than it appeared to, "I should have pushed those reports harder." He'd said it looking at the paperwork rather than at Caleb. Caleb had said, "You did what you could with what you had," which was true and also insufficient, and they both knew it. But it was the thing that could actually be said in that room at that moment, and so he'd said it. Now he was here. Nina met him at reception and walked him through the building. The engineering floor on 15, the product development lab at the back of 14, the small team of 3 that made up the field operations division, which was where he would technically sit. She introduced him to people whose names he worked to keep organized. Most of them were younger than him by at least a decade. Most of them had graduate degrees in biomedical engineering or systems design. They were polite and measured in the way that people are polite and measured when they're not yet sure what to do with someone who doesn't fit the existing categories. One of them, a young woman named Priya, who worked in product validation, asked him what his background was. When he told her, she nodded with an expression he couldn't fully read and said, "So you're coming from the field side," in a way that was neither dismissive nor enthusiastic, just placing him on a map she was constructing. 11 years of it, he said. "That should be useful," she said, which he thought was an honest answer rather than a polite one. Derek Sato found him after lunch and took him to the product lab. It was a room that smelled like electronics and industrial cleaner and contained, in various states of assembly or testing, equipment that Caleb recognized from different points in its life cycle. Things he'd maintained in the field, here in the form they'd taken before the real world got to them. It felt slightly disorienting, like meeting someone's younger version. "Vivian wants to take you to Cascade Regional on Thursday," Derek said. "It's a hospital in Salem. They installed our Series 6 pump system 8 months ago, and they've been reporting intermittent flow regulation issues. We've sent 2 engineers down, and neither of them could replicate the problem in testing." "What did they find?" "Nothing definitive. The equipment tests clean every time." Caleb looked at the Series 6 unit on the table in front of him. It was newer than anything he'd worked with at Hargrove, considerably more sophisticated, with a digital pressure regulation interface and a modular component architecture that was clearly designed for easier servicing. On paper, it was a better machine than what he'd been maintaining. "What are the flow irregularities doing? Are they consistent in timing?" "No, that's part of what's frustrating. They're random enough that the engineers couldn't identify a pattern." "What time of day do they typically get reported?" Derek looked at him. "The incident logs show most of them are in the afternoon, between 1 and 4. Caleb looked at the unit. "What's the HVAC situation like in the installation area?" Derek was quiet for a second. "I don't know. If the reports cluster in the afternoon and the equipment tests clean in controlled conditions, I'd want to look at ambient temperature variation around the installation site. These digital regulation interfaces can be sensitive to temperature differentials that wouldn't show up in the specs but would show up in a real building that's been running its heating system all day." Derek was looking at him with an expression that was recalibrating. "The engineers didn't look at that." "They were looking at the equipment," Caleb said. "You also need to look at the room." Derek wrote something down. Then he looked up and said, "Thursday's going to be a useful trip." Vivian drove to Salem herself, which surprised him. He'd expected a car service or a company vehicle with someone else at the wheel, but she was already in the parking garage at 6:40 in the morning with a dark blue sedan and a travel mug, and she told him to put his bag in the back, and he did. She drove the way she did everything, efficiently and without wasted movement. And for the first 20 minutes of the drive, they talked through what he should be looking for at Cascade Regional. She knew the technical details well, better than he'd expected, asking specific questions about installation tolerances and ambient sensitivity thresholds and the field variance data from their existing units in the Pacific Northwest. Somewhere past Wilsonville, she asked, "How's the transition been?" "To the job?" "To all of it. It's a significant change." He looked out at the highway. The morning was clear for a change, the light coming low and flat from the east. "It's been a week," he said. "I'm still figuring out what I don't know." "That's the right answer," she said. "The people who worry me are the ones who come in the first week thinking they've figured it out. Your engineers think I'm a maintenance guy who got lucky." She was quiet for a beat. "Some of them. Derek doesn't." She glanced at him briefly. "Derek is the one whose opinion matters on the technical side. He'll come around on the others once you're useful, and you will be." "You sound confident about that." "I've been hiring people for 40 years. I have a reasonable track record of knowing who's going to be useful." He let that sit for a moment. "The reports you saw. From Hargrove. What was it specifically that made you want to meet with me?" She thought about it. He appreciated that she thought about it rather than answering immediately. "The pattern recognition," she said. "Most maintenance logs are reactive, so someone reports a problem, a technician responds, the problem gets addressed, or doesn't. Yours were predictive. You were identifying failure modes before they became failures, and documenting the conditions that would lead there. That's not something you learn from a certification. That comes from genuine attention over a long period of time." She paused. "Also the way you wrote them. Clear, specific, no excess. You weren't covering yourself with the documentation. You were actually trying to fix the problems. For all the good it did. It did more good than you know. I forwarded your Hargrove reports to 3 people on our board. The freight elevator situation is going to reach the facilities administration through channels that don't go through Walter Briggs." Caleb turned to look at her. She was watching the road. "You didn't tell me that," he said. "I'm telling you now." She took a sip from her travel mug. "The documentation you created is evidence of a systemic failure in how that facility manages maintenance infrastructure. It deserves to go somewhere that can act on it." She glanced at him. "Does that bother you?" He thought about it. He thought about Rosa saying that's not good enough. He thought about Terrence sounding like he was working not to panic over 2 patients with dark pump screens. "No," he said. "It doesn't bother me." "Good, but..." Cascade Regional was the mid-sized hospital in the southern part of Salem, newer construction than Hargrove, better funded, with the kind of facility management infrastructure that had actual budget lines for preventive maintenance. The director of clinical engineering, a methodical man named Gordon Reese, met them in the lobby and walked them up to the cardiac recovery unit where the Series 6 pumps were installed. The installation was clean. 8 units, properly mounted, correctly wired, with clear service access panels and appropriate documentation posted. Caleb looked at each unit without touching anything, walking the length of the corridor, noting the placement, the proximity to the windows, the ceiling vent positions. Then he stood at the end of the corridor and looked at the space as a whole. "What's on the other side of that wall?" he asked, pointing to the exterior wall on the south end. Gordon looked. "Loading dock." "Is it enclosed or open to the outside?" "Open. We get delivery trucks in there most mornings." "And the heating return duct for this corridor. Where does it pull from?" Gordon thought about it. "It crosses that wall, I think. I'd have to check the building plan." Caleb looked at the ceiling vents. They were positioned at regular intervals along the corridor, standard installation, nothing obviously wrong. He walked to the south end of the corridor and put his hand near the last vent in the row, near the exterior wall. The airflow was noticeably cooler than the vents at the north end. "Your return duct is pulling in cold air from adjacent to the loading dock," he said. "Every afternoon when the delivery activity drops off and the dock doors close, the temperature differential in this end of the corridor shifts. The units down here are registering the ambient change and the digital regulation interface is compensating, but the compensation is triggering a micro-adjustment cycle that's reading on your monitors as an irregularity. The equipment is actually functioning correctly. It's responding to a real variable. The problem is the variable." Gordon was looking at the vent. Vivian was looking at Caleb. "Can you document what you just told me?" Gordon said. "I can do better than that. I can give you the specific duct section to inspect and a proposed fix that won't require taking the units offline." Vivian said nothing, but when Caleb looked at her, she had an expression he couldn't quite name. Not surprise, exactly. More like recognition. He spent the next 2 hours with Gordon in the building's mechanical system, tracing the duct path and confirming the cold air infiltration point, writing everything into his field notebook with measurements and sketches and specific references to the corridor positioning. By the time they were done, Gordon was shaking his head with the expression of someone who'd had 2 rounds of engineers come through his facility without finding what a maintenance supervisor found in 90 minutes. The engineers were looking at the equipment, Caleb said, because he'd already said it once and it was still true. We'll get this fixed, Gordon said. He looked at Vivian. This kind of consultation is what we've needed. On the drive back to Portland, Vivian was quiet for the first 30 miles. Not uncomfortable quiet. Thinking quiet. Caleb had learned in 1 week to tell the difference. There are 11 other facilities in Oregon and Washington with Series 6 installations, she said finally. You want me to visit all of them? Not necessarily, but I want you to build a protocol for how a field evaluation should be conducted. Not just the equipment, but the installation environment. What questions to ask. What to look for. What the equipment is responding to that the spec doesn't account for. She glanced at him. Can you do that? I can do that. Good. She looked back at the road. Derek's going to want to be involved. He'll push back on some of it. That's fine. He should. She almost smiled. Most people don't say that when I tell them someone's going to push back on their work. If his pushback is good, it makes the protocol better. If it's not, I'll tell him it's not. This time she did smile briefly, eyes still on the road. Yes, she said. You will. The new room he found in late November was in Northeast Portland, a second-floor unit in a house owned by a woman in her 70s named Bev, who'd converted the upstairs after her husband died. It was small, a bedroom, a bathroom, a galley kitchen with a window that looked out over the backyard. But the heat worked, which was no longer something he took for granted, and Bev left him alone in the specific way of someone who understood that alone time was what he needed, even if she didn't know the reasons. He moved in on a Saturday with the help of Marcus, who'd driven up from Boise with a truck and a six-pack he'd consumed with a level of efficiency that suggested he'd been planning the drive for a while. It's small, Marcus said, standing in the middle of the bedroom. It's fine. It's small, Caleb. I know it's small. It's fine. I'm not hosting a party. Marcus looked at the window in the backyard and seemed to make a decision about not pushing the point. They got everything upstairs in 3 hours, which included the boxes from the storage unit that Caleb hadn't opened since packing them 9 months ago. Some of them he opened that night after Marcus left. The practical ones, kitchen things, and work clothes. The box with the photographs he put in the closet and left closed. He stood in the middle of the room that night with the bed made and the kitchen organized and his tools in the corner and looked at the shape of the space that was now his. It wasn't much, but it was clean and it was quiet and he could see the backyard from the window, bare trees and a rusted bird feeder and the specific gray-brown of late November, and nothing in the room required anything of him that he hadn't chosen to give. That was something. That counted. I was 3 weeks into the new job when Elena called. He was in the product lab at Cross Medical, reading through field reports from the 11 Pacific Northwest installations, when his phone buzzed and her name came up on the screen. He looked at it for a second. Then he stepped out into the hallway and answered. Hey, he said. Hi. A beat. Is this an okay time? Yeah, give me a second. He walked to the far end of the hallway where it was quieter. Okay, what's up? I found the coffee grinder, she said. He didn't say anything for a moment. The red one, she said, from the cabinet above the fridge. I've been going through some of the things we split up, and I found it in a box with some of your stuff that got mixed in with mine. I wanted to let you know in case you wanted it. The coffee grinder had been his mother's, given to him when she moved into assisted living 3 years before she died. It was a small manual grinder, red enamel with a chrome handle, nothing valuable except that it was hers and therefore his, and he'd been looking for it vaguely since the split without saying anything about it. Yeah, he said, I'd like that back. I figured I could drop it off somewhere, or, she stopped, or we could just meet somewhere and I could give it to you, if that's not weird. He thought about it. It's a little weird, he said. I know. A pause. We could meet somewhere public. Make it a short thing. Okay, he said. Yeah, we can do that. They agreed on a coffee place on Alberta Street the following Saturday. He kept the call brief, and when he hung up, he stood in the hallway for a moment holding the phone and trying to identify what he felt, which turned out to be more complicated than he'd expected. But Saturday was cold but clear. He got there first and found a table near the window, and he was halfway through a cup of coffee when Elena came in, unwrapping a scarf he didn't recognize, looking for him across the room. She looked okay. That was his first thought, and it arrived with a complicated mixture of things. Relief and something sadder underneath it that he couldn't fully name. She was wearing her hair differently, a little shorter, and she looked tired around the eyes in the way that people look when they've been managing more than they're letting on, which was something he recognized because he spent most of his life looking exactly the same way. She sat down across from him and put the coffee grinder on the table in a paper bag. He thanked her. She ordered coffee, and for a minute they had the particular awkwardness of two people who know each other very well and are trying to find the register that fits this specific configuration of them. You look better, she said. I feel better. Mostly. I heard you left Hargrove. End of November. New job. She looked at him. What happened? He told her the short version, the storm, the pump station, Vivian Cross, the folder, the 2 weeks' notice. He kept it factual and brief. She listened with the focused attention that was one of the things he'd always appreciated about her, even when that same focus had sometimes felt like pressure. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Caleb, that's a serious company. I know. Why do you look like I just told you something bad? He almost laughed. I don't. You do. You've got that face you make when something good happens and you're waiting for it to stop. He looked at the table. It's a big change. I'm still finding my footing. You always find your footing, she said, and then seemed to register what she'd said and where they were, and looked at her coffee cup. I mean, that's not wrong, even if the context is weird to say it in. No, it's okay. He looked at her. How are you doing? I'm fine. She said it the way he used to say it, which he thought she probably recognized because she then said, I'm actually fine. I've had some hard weeks, but it's getting easier. That's what Mrs. Farrow said. Elena looked at him with an expression that was surprised and then genuinely, briefly amused. Mrs. Farrow told you it gets easier? In the parking lot, the day I picked up the toolbox. Elena shook her head slowly. She probably knew more about how we were doing than we did. She heard every argument we had, and brought you soup when you had the flu. And brought me soup when I had the flu. He paused. She was good people. Elena wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The morning light through the window was doing something specific to the room, the way winter light sometimes did when it was clean and low and made everything look a little more honest than usual. I'm sorry, Elena said, for the way things ended. I know I said that in a general sense during the process, but I mean specifically, I gave up trying to get through to you about a year before we actually called it. I just stopped trying, and I think that was its own kind of damage. He looked at her. I wasn't making it easy. No, but I didn't fight for it the way I maybe should have. I got tired, and I handled tired by pulling back. She looked at him steadily. And you were dealing with your dad, and the money, and carrying all of it by yourself, and instead of making it safe for you to put it down somewhere, I made it less safe. I know that. He thought about telling her that wasn't fair to herself. He didn't say it, because it was true enough that arguing with it would have been dishonest, and they'd had enough dishonesty between them in the form of silence and avoidance to last a long time. I should have told you about the money, he said, before it was already a problem. I knew I should, and I kept not doing it. Why? He'd thought about this. He'd had a lot of time to think about it. Because telling you would have made it real in a way I could see on your face. And I didn't know how to handle what I saw on your face when things were bad. I shut down instead. She nodded slowly. She didn't argue with that either. Your dad, she said. How is he? Good days and bad. More bad lately. He looked at his coffee. I moved closer to Kamas when I found the new room. I can get there faster now. I'm glad, she said, and she meant it. He could tell she meant it, which was its own specific feeling to navigate. They stayed for another half hour. They didn't solve anything, and they didn't try to. They talked about her work. She'd moved into a director role at the health system where she'd been for 4 years. More responsibility, better pay, long hours. They talked about the apartment on Hemming and how she was thinking about moving into something smaller when the lease came up. They talked about a movie they'd seen together 4 years ago that had come up somehow, and they disagreed about it the way they used to disagree about things, lightly and specifically, and it didn't hurt the way he'd been afraid it might. When she stood up to leave, she picked up her scarf and then paused. "I'm glad you got the job, she said. "I mean that. I know. And Caleb." She looked at him with the directness she'd always had when she actually meant something. "Stop deciding that every hard thing is yours to carry alone. It was the thing that did the most damage between us, and I think you know that." He sat with that for a second. "I'm working on it," he said. She nodded once, wrapped her scarf, and left. He sat at the table alone for a while. The morning light was still doing its thing through the window. He picked up the paper bag with the coffee grinder in it and turned it in his hands once. Then he finished his coffee, put his jacket on, and walked out into the cold. He drove to Camas that afternoon. It was one of the bad days. His father didn't know him when he first walked in, looked at him with the careful blankness of someone trying to place a face that won't resolve. Caleb pulled the chair over and sat down and started talking about the weather and the drive, and a football game he'd watched the night before, letting his voice fill the room without demanding anything back. "About 20 minutes in," his father said, "you came a long way." "Not that far," Caleb said. "Hour and change." "Still," his father looked at him, "you didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't have to." His father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the uncertain way of someone speaking from behind fog, "Caleb." "Yeah, Pop." His father nodded slowly. That was all. Just the name and the nod, confirming something he'd found that he'd been looking for. Caleb stayed for 3 hours. He brought a deck of cards, and they played a game his father had taught him as a kid, a simple rummy variant with rules his father had invented and changed whenever he was losing. His father changed the rules twice that afternoon, which made Caleb think it was a better day than it had started out being. When he left, it was dark, and the temperature had dropped enough that his breath was visible in the parking lot. He sat in the truck for a minute before starting it, the engine ticking, his hands on the wheel. He thought about what Elena had said. He thought about what Marcus had said. He thought about his father looking for his name in the fog and finding it and nodding like that was enough, like just finding it was a kind of victory. He thought about 11 years of maintenance reports and one conversation in a hospital hallway during a storm, and the distance between the life he'd had 3 months ago and wherever he was now, which was imperfect and uncertain and still full of things he hadn't figured out, but which felt, for the first time in longer than he could accurately pinpoint, like something he'd chosen rather than something that had simply accumulated around him while he wasn't paying attention. He started the truck and pulled out of the parking lot and drove north into the dark, the heater coming on properly within the first 2 minutes, the road ahead wet and clear and lit up in the reach of his headlights, as far as he could see. January came in cold and stayed that way. The field evaluation protocol Caleb had been building since December was now 14 pages long, and Derek Sato had pushed back on 6 sections of it, which was about what Caleb had expected. They'd had 3 working sessions in the product lab that ran long and got specific and occasionally tense, in the way that 2 people who both know what they're talking about get tense when they disagree. And after each session, Derek would send follow-up notes that were critical and detailed and always, Caleb had to admit, worth reading. By the 3rd session, the pushback had shifted register slightly, less skeptical, more collaborative. And by the end of the week, they'd landed on a version of the protocol that was better than what either of them had started with. Priya, who worked in the lab next to the conference room where they'd been meeting, passed Caleb in the hallway after the final session and said, "Derek doesn't revise his thinking very often." She said it neutrally, as if reporting a meteorological fact. "Just so you know." "I noticed," Caleb said. "It means he respects what you brought in." Or he just wanted to argue. She almost smiled. Both things can be true. He'd been at Cross Medical 2 months, and the shape of the work was becoming clearer to him. Not comfortable, not yet, but legible. He understood where he fit and where he didn't, and more importantly, he understood that the place where he fit was genuinely useful rather than decorative, which was the thing he'd needed to know. The 11 Pacific Northwest facility visits were being scheduled one by one. He'd completed 4, and each one had found something the standard technical evaluation had missed. Not always dramatic, not always immediately critical, but real. A cooling issue affecting diagnostic calibration in Tacoma. A vibration transmission problem in a Bellingham installation that was accelerating wear on a mounting bracket. Small things that would have become larger things, documented in the same methodical way he'd always documented things, except that now the documentation went somewhere that was still new enough that he noticed it every time. The call from Riverbend came on a Tuesday morning in late January while he was in the Cross Medical parking garage walking to his truck. It was the facility director, a calm woman named Dr. Patricia Howe, and she said the words carefully in the way that people in clinical settings have learned to say the words that carry the most weight. That Hank Mercer had experienced a significant cardiac event overnight, that he was stable, but that the situation had changed, and that Caleb should come when he could. He was on the road within 12 minutes. He called Marcus from the highway, and Marcus said he'd get a flight, and Caleb said, "Don't do that yet. Let me see what's happening first." And Marcus said he was getting a flight regardless, and would be in Portland by evening. And Caleb didn't argue because he didn't have the energy to, and also because he didn't want to. His father was awake when he got there. That was the first thing. He'd prepared himself in the car for something worse, and when he walked into the room and his father's eyes tracked to him immediately, clear and present in a way they hadn't been in weeks, the relief was physical enough that he had to stop in the doorway for a second. "Hey," his father said. His voice was thinner than usual, but his eyes were sharp. "Hey, Pop?" Caleb pulled the chair over and sat close. "You gave me a scare." "I gave myself a scare." A pause. "My chest felt like someone parked a truck on it." That's what a cardiac event feels like, apparently. "Nobody told me that was on the schedule." Caleb looked at him. The monitors beside the bed were steady, the numbers in the ranges the nurse had told him to expect. His father's hands were on top of the blanket, and Caleb reached over and put his hand over them, which wasn't something he did often, and his father turned his hand over and held on, which told him something about the night his father had been through. "I'm here," Caleb said, because it was the only true and useful thing. "I know," his father said. "You always come." Dr. Howe found him in the hallway an hour later and walked him through what had happened and what came next. The cardiac event had been significant enough to warrant a medication adjustment and a care plan review. His father's overall trajectory, she said with the measured honesty that Caleb had learned to appreciate in the medical people who did their jobs well, his father's overall trajectory had shifted. Not a crisis, not an emergency right now, but a shift. "What does that mean in practical terms?" Caleb asked. "It means we're in a different phase than we were. He needs more monitoring, more support. His care needs are going to increase." She looked at him directly. "Have you thought about whether Riverbend remains the right fit as his needs change?" He had thought about it. He'd been thinking about it since the fall, in the background, the way you think about things you're not ready to make a decision about. "He's comfortable here," Caleb said. "The staff know him." "That matters. It's also not the only thing that matters." He nodded. "I'll look at what's available closer to Portland. Can you give me a list of what to look for in terms of cardiac care support?" "I'll have someone from our care coordination team put together information for you," she said. He thanked her and went back to his father's room. Marcus arrived that evening with a carry-on bag and the specific expression he wore when he was managing worry by staying in motion. He'd flown Portland on 2 hours' notice and taken a ride-share from the airport and arrived at Riverbend at 7:15 looking like a man who hadn't eaten since morning. "He's awake," Caleb told him in the hallway. "Having a decent evening, all things considered." Marcus let out a breath that had been stored up since Caleb's call on the highway. "Okay. He's going to want to give you a hard time about something. Just let him." Marcus almost laughed. "When does he not?" They went in together, and Hank looked at both his sons with the expression of a man who found the situation mildly embarrassing in proportion to how much he was reassured by it. He told Marcus his flight had probably cost too much. Marcus said he'd gotten a deal. His father said he doubted that. Marcus said he was wrong. His father told him his haircut looked expensive and asked if he was spending Donna's money again, and Marcus said his haircut was $32, and his father looked at Caleb and said, $32 for a haircut, with the tone of someone delivering a verdict, and Caleb said, "I know, Pop." And for a little while, the room was just the three of them arguing about nothing, which was what they'd always done, and which was the specific form of love their family had always spoken in because the other forms were harder to say out loud. Later, when his father had drifted to sleep, they sat in the small family lounge at the end of the corridor. Marcus had found a vending machine sandwich that he was eating with the determination of a man who understood it was terrible and didn't care. "He looks smaller," Marcus said. "Yeah. When did that happen?" "Gradually." Caleb looked at the linoleum floor. "Then all at once." Marcus was quiet. "What do we do?" "The care coordinator is putting together information on facilities closer to Portland with better cardiac support. I'm going to look at them this week and figure out what makes sense." "What does it cost?" "More than Riverbend. I'll figure it out." "Caleb, I'll figure it out, Marcus. The new job pays better than Hargrove by enough that it's manageable if I'm careful. We can split it." Caleb looked at his brother. Marcus had a mortgage and 2 kids in school, and Donna worked part-time. "Let's see what the numbers look like," he said. "I'm not going to tell you no before I know what the actual number is." That was as far as he'd come on letting people help. Not there yet, but further than he'd been in October. Marcus seemed to understand that and didn't push. "He said something to me," Marcus said. "When I went in before you got there, he thought I was you at first. He does that sometimes. He said, you figured it out. I knew you would." Marcus looked at the vending machine sandwich. Then he realized I was me, and he said my haircut was too expensive. He paused. But he'd said it. Whoever he thought he was saying it to. Caleb didn't respond for a moment. The fluorescent lights in the lounge were the same kind as every hospital corridor he'd ever stood in, and they made everything look the same kind of tired. "He was saying it to both of us," Caleb said finally. Marcus nodded. They sat in the lounge until midnight when the nursing staff came by to check and told them gently that Hank was stable and resting well and they should get some sleep. Marcus took the pull-out chair in their father's room. Caleb drove back to Portland through the empty highway and was in bed by 1. He found a facility called Westbrook Care in southwest Portland. 6 days later, a smaller building than Riverbend, quieter, with a dedicated cardiac monitoring unit and a full-time cardiologist on staff 2 days a week. The rooms were decent. The staff-to-resident ratio was better. The cost was higher than Riverbend by an amount that was real, but not impossible, and when he sat with the actual numbers and looked at the budget he'd been quietly building since starting at Cross Medical, he found that with the salary difference and the debt he'd been systematically paying down, he could manage it without asking Marcus, though Marcus had already transferred money into his account without asking, with a message that just said for Pop, "Don't argue and no punctuation." He didn't argue. The transfer to Westbrook took 3 weeks to arrange. He drove his father there on a Saturday morning in February, Hank in the passenger seat with a blanket across his lap and his old radio in a box in the back seat, because Caleb had learned by now that the objects that meant something needed to travel with the person. His father was quiet most of the drive. Somewhere on the Barber Boulevard approach, he looked out the window at the city and said, "This is Portland?" "Yeah, closer to me now." His father settled back. "I haven't been to Portland in a while." "I know. Your mother liked Portland." "She did." His father looked at the city going past. "She would have liked that you're doing better," he said. Caleb kept his eyes on the road. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "I think she would have." Westbrook's intake coordinator was a young man named Theo who had the specific gift of making paperwork feel like something other than paperwork. And the room they'd prepared for his father had a window that looked south toward the West Hills, bare-treed and gray in February, but real, something to look at. Caleb helped set up the room, the radio on the dresser, the photograph of his mother on the nightstand, the extra blanket that his father had had since Caleb was a child, the blue-plaid wool one that smelled like the house they'd grown up in no matter how many times it was washed. When everything was set up, his father sat in the chair by the window and looked at the room and then at Caleb. "You did good," his father said. It was a simple sentence, 4 words. Caleb stood there and received it the way you receive things that arrive too late to be easy, and said, "I'm trying to." Hargrove Rehabilitation Center underwent a facility audit in March. Caleb heard about it from Rosa, who called him on a Wednesday evening while he was making dinner, real dinner this time, not pasta from a pot, but an actual meal with things that required preparation, which had become a minor project he'd started in February as a way of giving the evening structure. "You heard?" she said. "I heard what?" "The freight elevator is finally getting replaced. They're bringing in a contractor next month. Full hydraulic system overhaul." A pause. "And the board is requiring an independent review of the maintenance infrastructure. They brought in an outside firm." He turned the heat down on the stove. "What triggered it?" "Officially, a compliance flag from the state. Unofficially," she stopped. "Someone with board connections got information in front of the right people. I don't know who." He did know who. He hadn't said anything about it to anyone because it wasn't his to announce, but he knew. "And Briggs?" he said. "Still there. But there are new reporting requirements going through him now. He's not going to be able to sit on anything the way he did before." Her voice had the tone of someone who'd been waiting a long time for a specific thing to happen. "The hub on the third-floor overflow circuit got properly repaired last week. The permanent fix, not your bypass." "Good. Caleb." She was quiet for a second. "The audit documentation. They're using your maintenance reports as the baseline. 22 months of your reports are what they're measuring the current state against." She paused. "I thought you should know that." He stood in his kitchen in the house on Northeast Portland with his hand on the stove handle and thought about a gray folder in a filing cabinet in a basement office and a field notebook he'd filled and replaced 11 times in 11 years. "Thanks for telling me," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for writing them down. All of them, even when nobody was reading them." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just said, "Take care of yourself, Rosa." "You too," she said, and hung up. He stood there for a minute. Then he turned the heat back up and finished making dinner. Well, he and Elena met one more time in April at a park on the east side where they used to walk sometimes on Sunday mornings in the early years of the marriage, before the years got heavy. It wasn't planned. She'd texted asking if he wanted to walk, and he'd said yes, and they'd met at the entrance and fallen into a pace that was easy enough that the awkwardness of the first 10 minutes had time to work itself out. The park was coming back into green the way Portland did in April. Hesitantly at first, then all at once, like the city had finally decided to commit. They walked the path that went along the creek and talked about ordinary things. Her new role at work, a kitchen renovation she was having done at the apartment she'd moved into, a podcast they'd apparently both started listening to independently, which they discovered accidentally and which made them both laugh in the specific way of people who find something unexpectedly familiar in the wreckage of a shared life. "How's your dad?" she asked. "Better than February. The cardiac monitoring at the new place caught a medication dosage that needed adjusting. He's been more stable." "He always liked me," she said, not with vanity but with the honesty of someone stating something that was true and a little painful. Even at the end. "He asked about you in March," Caleb said. "On a good day. He asked if you were okay." She was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell him?" "I said yes, that you were doing well." That was kind. It was also true. She looked at the creek. The water was high from the spring runoff, moving fast and brown. I want you to know I'm not looking to reopen anything," she said. "That's not what this is." "I know. She stopped and seemed to be finding the specific thing she meant. "I didn't want the last version of us to be the version from the courthouse. I needed us to have a different last version." He understood that. He'd felt the same thing without having found the words for it. "This is better," he said. "Yeah." She nodded. "It is." They walked to the far end of the path and back. Near the park entrance, she stopped and reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. "I found this when I was packing up some stuff from the old storage boxes. It's a photo of your dad and your grandfather. I think it's from the 60s. They're both in work clothes and there's a car in the background. I don't know what they were doing." He opened the envelope. The photograph was black and white, slightly curled at the edges, and his grandfather was in it. A man he'd met only twice as a small child, big hands, same set to the jaw that his father had, and that Caleb saw in the mirror. His father was young in the photograph, maybe 20, and he was laughing at something outside the frame. He hadn't known this photograph existed. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in a way that required no elaboration. She squeezed his arm once, briefly, and then they said goodbye at the entrance and went their separate ways. And it was not a dramatic parting, and it was not a sad one. It was the particular kind of ending that is also a closing of something that needed to be closed, clean and quiet and real. He drove home with the photograph on the passenger seat. Spring moved into summer the way it always did in Portland, unreliably, with rain persisting into June and then sun arriving in July with the force of something that had been waiting. Caleb's work at Cross Medical had expanded by then, the field protocol formalized and being applied across facilities in 3 states, with 2 engineers from Derek's team now conducting evaluations alongside him, and learning, in the way that people learn things best, by doing them in the field rather than reading about them in a controlled environment. He still carried the field notebook. He'd filled 4 of them since starting at Cross Medical. The same brand, same size, same black cover, because the continuity of the object mattered to him in a way he didn't feel the need to explain to anyone. Vivian had seen one of them at a team meeting in May and said, without ceremony, that the field notes from the Salem visit and the Tacoma evaluation had been included in a product development review that led to a firmware update for the Series 6 pressure regulation system, a change that would be deployed across every unit in the field. He'd nodded and said he was glad they were useful. She'd looked at him with the particular expression she'd had a few times before, the recognition one, and moved on to the next item on the agenda. He thought about that sometimes. The notes in the notebook becoming a firmware update, becoming a change in how a machine behaved in a clinical setting somewhere, a change that would prevent a problem that hadn't happened yet, that would never be attributed to a maintenance supervisor's field notebook, that would just be a thing the equipment now did differently and better. The work that exists inside the outcome without ever being visible in it. He'd spent 11 years documenting problems in a building where the documentation went nowhere, and he'd kept doing it because the documentation was what you could control when you couldn't control what happened to it. And somewhere in those 22 months of reports, the record had found its way to someone who understood what it was worth, and the elevator at Hargrove was getting replaced, and the hub on the 3rd floor was properly fixed, and somewhere in a hospital he'd never visit. A Series 6 pump system was regulating flow more reliably because of notes he'd written with a ballpoint pen on lined paper. You didn't always get to see how the thread connected, but it connected. His father died on a Sunday morning in August. It was peaceful, which was the word Dr. Howe used when she called, and which Caleb had heard used about deaths before, and had never been sure he believed, but which in this case he did believe because he'd been there the evening before and his father had been asleep and calm and breathing steadily. And the room had the specific quiet of a place where something was ending without violence or alarm. He'd sat with him for 3 hours that Saturday evening. His father had woken once, briefly, and looked at Caleb with eyes that were present in a way they hadn't been reliably for months, and said, "You staying?" "For a while," Caleb said. "Good." And his father had closed his eyes again, and his breathing had evened out, and Caleb had sat in the chair by the window as the summer evening light moved across the room, and had talked quietly about nothing in particular. A game on the radio, the drive over, the backyard at Bev's where a pair of birds had started nesting in the old feeder, things that didn't require a response and weren't asking for one. He drove home that night feeling something he couldn't name, not grief yet, that came later, in waves, and with less warning than he expected. Something else. Something that sat alongside the sadness. The knowledge that he had shown up every time, every Sunday, every call, every paperwork battle with the insurance company, and every conversation with the care coordinators, and every morning he'd sat in a chair beside a man who sometimes didn't know his name and talked to him anyway, because the talking mattered regardless of whether it landed. He'd learned that from his father. His father, who had raised 2 boys mostly alone after their mother got sick, who'd worked in a warehouse for 30 years without complaint, who'd taught Caleb to fix engines by standing beside him and letting him figure it out and only correcting the things that would cause actual damage. His father, who'd never said "I love you" easily, but who'd shown up at every school event and driven through snowstorms and sat in hospital waiting rooms and taught him, without naming what he was teaching, that showing up was the thing. That showing up, consistently, without demanding recognition for it, was the whole of it. He thought about this at the funeral, a small service that Marcus organized because Marcus was better at that kind of thing, with a few of his father's friends from the old neighborhood and a cousin who'd driven up from Eugene and Rosa Medina, who came without being asked because she'd known his father through the times Caleb had talked about him over 11 years of working together, and whose presence in that small room meant more than he told her. Marcus gave a short eulogy that was better than either of them expected it to be, because Marcus had the gift of saying the true thing without ornamentation. And the true thing was that Hank Mercer had been a man who worked hard and asked for little and loved his sons in the particular inarticulate way that men of his generation loved, through action, through presence, through the accumulated weight of years of showing up, and that this had been enough, more than enough. Caleb didn't speak at the service. He sat in the front row and listened and held the knowledge of his father close, and when it was over he stood outside in the August heat and shook hands with people who said the things people say, and let them say it because that was what the moment needed. August turned to September. The grief came and went with the unpredictable timing of all real grief, present at odd moments, absent when he expected it, returning with force when it chose to. He sat with it without trying to fix it, which was itself a different approach from the one he'd spent most of his life taking. He called Marcus more than he used to. He ate dinner at the table instead of standing over the counter. He let Bev, his landlord, invite him for coffee one Sunday morning without manufacturing an excuse, and discovered she'd spent 30 years as a social worker and had opinions about everything and told them plainly, which he found unexpectedly useful. The field notebook he'd been using when his father died he didn't immediately replace. He kept it in his jacket pocket empty for 2 weeks, the way you keep a space open when you're not ready to fill it. Then he went back to work. The third Pacific Northwest site visit in September was a facility in Olympia, Washington, a small rehabilitation center, privately run, with a cross-medical installation that was 18 months old and clean by the numbers, but that had a service history he wanted to look at in person. He drove up on a Tuesday, the September morning clear and blue, in the way that late summer held on in the Pacific Northwest before it let go, and walked the facility the way he always walked a facility, starting in the basement and working up. He found what he was looking for on the second floor, a vibration signature and a mounting assembly that the standard service inspection had logged as within tolerance, but that had the pattern he'd learned to recognize, the one that told you something was moving toward a failure point rather than away from it. He documented it in the new notebook, measured it, wrote the specific recommendation, and called Derek on the drive back. "Second floor east corridor," he said. "Mounting assembly on Unit 4. It's not critical right now, but it will be in approximately 90 days if the service interval stays the same. I'd recommend moving up the next inspection and replacing the isolating bushings." "I'll schedule it," Derek said. Then, without preamble, "Priya wants to include the Salem case study in the product development review for the Series 7. She's presenting next month. She wants to know if you'd come in and speak to the field observations directly." "Yeah," Caleb said, "I can do that." "She'll be in touch." A pause. "Good catch on the mounting assembly." "Thanks." He drove the rest of the way to Portland with the radio on and the windows cracked and the September air coming through, cool and clean, and thought about almost nothing. Just the road and the trees and the particular feeling of a day's work that had done what it was supposed to do. Sad. I went to the park on the east side one more time that fall, alone, on a Sunday morning when the leaves had turned and the light was doing what October light did, making everything look like it was being seen clearly for the first time. He stood by the creek where he and Elena had walked in April and looked at the water, lower now than it had been in spring, moving quietly over the rocks, and he thought about the year behind him and the shape it had made. He'd lost a marriage and found, in the aftermath of it, that some of what the marriage had cost him had been things he'd chosen to pay. The silence, the carrying everything alone, the habit of deciding that asking for help was a kind of failure. He'd watched his father's mind dissolve in pieces and had shown up every week through it, and that had cost him something too, and it had also been the most important thing he'd done. He'd spent 11 years doing good work inside a system that absorbed it without giving it back, and then in the space of one storm and one hallway conversation, the work had found its way into the world after all. He was 41 years old. He lived in a small room in northeast Portland with a backyard and a rusted bird feeder, and a landlord who'd turned out to be one of the better people he knew. He carried a field notebook. He drove to facilities across 3 states and found the things that were moving toward failure, and he documented them. And the documentation went somewhere. He was not famous or particularly comfortable or over the worst of the grief or done with the mistakes he would inevitably keep making. He was none of the things that stories usually deliver at the end of hard years. But he was present in his own life in a way he hadn't been in a long time. Maybe not since before the money problems and the drives to Vancouver, and the silence that had grown up inside his marriage like something neither of them had planted, but both had failed to pull. What he'd learned, slowly, without wanting to, in the way real things are learned, was that the most dangerous thing he'd done for most of his adult life was decide that the right thing to do was to handle everything alone, quietly, without asking for anything. It had felt like responsibility. It had felt like strength. And it had been, in the end, a kind of fear dressed up as something admirable, the fear that needing something from another person made you a burden, that showing the difficult parts of yourself was a risk that wasn't worth taking. It had cost him his marriage. It had cost him years with his father that he'd spent managing rather than inhabiting. It had cost him connections he could have had if he'd been willing to be less composed in front of the people who were trying to love him. He didn't know how to be done with it yet. He still felt the pull toward it, still caught himself handling things quietly when he could have said something, still defaulted to "I'm fine" when the true answer was more complicated. Some things you learn too late to undo and just early enough to change. The creek moved past him, and the leaves came down one at a time from the trees above it, and a dog somewhere behind him was barking at something with the absolute commitment that dogs bring to barking, and a kid on a bike came past on the path and said, "On your left," the way they'd been taught, and everything was ordinary and specific and completely real. He took the photograph out of his jacket pocket, his father and his grandfather, the black and white one. Elena had given him at this same entrance in April. His father was 20 years old in it, laughing at something outside the frame. His grandfather's hands were visible beside him. The car in the background was a model Caleb couldn't identify. None of them had known what was coming. Not the grandfather, not the young laughing man who would become his father, not the photographer, whoever they were, capturing something ordinary on an ordinary day without knowing it, would end up in the jacket pocket of a man standing by a creek 60 years later, holding it like something he needed to keep. He looked at his father's face for a long time. Then he put the photograph back in his pocket, and he turned away from the creek, and he walked back toward the entrance the way he'd come, through the October light and the falling leaves and the ordinary morning of a life that was, imperfectly and incompletely, and without any promise of what came next, his own. Caleb had been, maybe 19, frustrated about something he couldn't now remember, and his father had said, without looking away from the road, "You don't have to figure it all out at once. You just have to keep going and pay attention." He hadn't understood it then. He thought it was the kind of thing adults said when they didn't have a real answer. He understood it now. He reached the parking lot, found the truck, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment with the engine off. The West Hills were visible from where he'd parked, pale and blue in the October haze. He started the engine. He had a facility visit in Tacoma on Tuesday, a call with Derek on Monday afternoon, dinner to make tonight, and a Sunday afternoon that belonged to no one but him. He pulled out of the lot and drove home.